You're listening to Cult Life with your host, Robin Jackson.
Hey, and welcome to another show, Cult Life, with me, your host, Robin Jackson. I continue the journey in this episode of losing the faith, my awakening. And the next installment talks about my adulthood, my journey into adulthood, and while I was still a member of the Jehovah's Witness cult. So, in 1987, I graduated from high school, and so too my journey into adulthood began. During that time, I fell in love with a young girl in the congregation, and we started courting. And during my high school graduation year, the matric farewell dance came up, and I was faced with another hurdle. Again, young witnesses were discouraged from attending this because of what Jehovah's Witnesses term as bad association, because you are associating with members outside the organization, and they are seen as not very good friends. So I, however, made it my resolve to attend the matric farewell dance that year, and I thoroughly enjoyed the association with my so-called worldly friends. The following year, I entered my working life. An automotive components manufacturing company employed me as an apprentice in the engineering field, an apprentice fitter. So I started training in the fitting trade, engineering trade. And I must admit, those first few months in the training center were very hard, as the amount of physical labor we did was often strenuous. Here I was, a 17-year-old fresh out of high school, and I was required to take up hand tools and engineering instruments and to shape metal within certain tolerances. Of course, this was all part of the learning curve within the training center. Filing and cutting workpieces out of solid metal were not an easy task, but it honed and improved my hand skills. So for the first 6 months, it was tiring, and I would often go home with blisters on my hands. And very often I contemplated leaving, the apprenticeship, but I stuck to it and gave it all, because I knew this would be part of my future, and it would hold me in good stead to actually be trained and become skilled in a certain trade. In contrast, however, many of my friends in the congregation had now applied to work at the South African branch of the Watchtower organization, which was situated in the outskirts of Johannesburg, it was around the time that the Bethel branch in Johannesburg was just completed, and finishing touches were being done to the branch in Krugersdorp. And at the time, many of the young brothers and sisters in the congregations were recruited to go and work at Bethel, go and live and work at Bethel. And much of the branch was still under construction, as I said. So giving up a chance to educate oneself at college or university, and choosing full-time service in so-called God's organization is seen as doing the right thing. So giving up and making that ultimate sacrifice is what's encouraged from the youngsters in the organization. Of course, higher education was frowned upon, and of course it encouraged its members to go into the full-time ministry, be it at Bethel or in the pioneer service. And this was because the end of this system of things was soon to come, so we would not need higher education then. This was what was taught to many young witnesses. So many of these young men and women, that went off to Bethel and went off into full-time service, were often seen as good marriage material by the peers in the organization, and young ones were encouraged to seek marriage mates amongst the Bethelites and the full-time ministers, of course. And a lot of these young men were swiftly appointed as ministerial servants, and some progressed to being elders in the organization because of their so-called spirituality, which was shown by the amount of hours they spent in the house-to-house work and the status they accrued as being a so-called Bethelite. And one mature elder in our congregation particularly pushed the young ones to strive for appointment to these positions. And I remember it very well because he was always around the youngsters, pushing them, the young males in the congregation, and encouraging them, and even going as far as to get them out of bed on Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings to go out in the house-to-house work. Now, although I was regular in giving talks on the Thursday night theocratic and ministry school, and of course commenting in the Watchtower studies on Sundays, I was not very fond of the house-to-house work, and I've said before, I don't think many witnesses are. So therefore, I was never really recommended as a candidate in the initial stages for advancement to ministerial servant status. So many of my peers in the congregations were appointed as ministerial servants, but more questions start to surface around that whole issue. Now, the Watchtower says that such ones are appointed as ministerial servants and elders by the Holy Spirit. But when I looked at the secret conduct of many of these, I often wondered if this was the case. You must remember that I was very close to many of the youngsters in the congregation, and first-hand knowledge, many of them got up to quite questionable practices, behind the scenes, while they were displaying this front of being good spiritual brothers. And many reports from our friends of the conduct of some of the Bethel, people at the Bethel branch in Johannesburg also kept worrying me. To me, this place was to be the holiest of holies, but what I heard of and sometimes saw happening there left me with more questions than answers. And I must admit, I saw myself as living a more moral life, if you could put it that way, than many high-ranking ones in the congregations. I loved and respected people, and I treated everyone with respect in comparison to many, of the many ministerial servants and elders that I would, interact with. And now I started to wonder, how is the amount of time I spend in the field ministry a measure of my spirituality? Right? Where in the Bible does it state this? So once again, I tried to push these thoughts to the back of my mind and told myself that I should, listen to the direction from Jehovah's organization with regard to this matter and avoid the questioning. Many times on the streets, we as colored and black brothers and sisters experienced racism from our very own brothers and sisters in the organization. Our very own fellow members in the other congregation, which was predominantly a white congregation and white membership would very often, we'd come across one another in the house-to-house ministry, and very often these, some of these brothers and sisters would not even greet us while witnessing on the streets of our very own town. And of course, this organization was supposed to pride itself on treating all men as equal. But from my experience, this was often not the case. And you must remember this is during apartheid South Africa as well. But I must also admit that many of the brothers and sisters and members of the congregation, the white, predominantly white congregation, were not all, displayed that form of racism, and I many times viewed them as this captive of this concept that the Watchtower organization teaches. I got married in 1991. I passed my final trade test in July of that very same year, and I could now provide for my wife and myself, of course. But I was soon to face my first conscience dilemma within the company I was employed at. The department I was employed to work in after I qualified, and passed my trade test, the department I worked in started manufacturing bomb shells for the South African military or the Defence Force. And of course, my Watchtower trained conscience did not allow me to repair and service the machines on that manufacturing line. I now had to approach my manager and make my individual, stand known. I called a meeting with him and calmly explained my situation. He did not take it very well and told me that, I will have to obey his instruction to work on that line. But after much debate, he eventually asked me which religion I, belonged to or I was a member of. I told him that I was a Jehovah's Witness, and to which he replied, well, that explains everything, but I will have to take this up with my superiors as well. Nothing came of it, and I was released from working on that production line. I continued to work at the company for 2 more years and left to start a new position at a pharmaceutical manufacturing company after that. The political climate in South Africa was now beginning to heat up. This was 1993. Winds of change were starting to blow during that time. Change which so many had fought and died for, was soon on the horizon. The ban on political parties such as the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, was now lifted, and peaceful talks and negotiations were set up. Of course, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and the country's first democratic election was approaching. And the whole world was watching and waiting for the outcome. So on the 27th of April 1994, South Africa's first democratic election was held. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide, however, are opposed to participation in any political activity. They take an uncompromising stand as to their refusal to salute the flag, also their objection to military service. And in South Africa, especially during the apartheid era, the conscription to military service for white male citizens was compulsory. And many young white Jehovah's Witness males faced the dilemma of facing military service or to be detained in prison as conscientious objectors. And one of my previous podcast, I actually unpack the whole military conscription dilemma that white male Jehovah's Witnesses faced in this country, and how the Watchtower actually handled and treated many of these brothers. So if you get time, look back into one of the earlier podcasts. So later, of course, voting took place, and of course was prohibited by us as Jehovah's Witnesses. And those few months leading up to and after the elections were quite tense. Rumors were abounding that there could be a civil war that could break out, and fears of terrorist activity was rife. People were told to stock up on essentials such as candles and canned foods in the event of power cuts and civil unrest. Supermarkets and the little corner shops in our little town could not keep up with the demand. But the transition to democracy, however, proved to be a peaceful one. But in 1995, more alarm bells started going off in my head. And this was the year that a major shift in one of the doctrines occurred. The talk amongst the witnesses was that new light on a certain teaching was to be made known in a Watchtower magazine. So by this time, I had never really read the magazines on receiving them. It was now and then that I actually took time to read articles in there, and many times I would, only read it before the actual Watchtower study, which was, normally on a Sunday morning or a Sunday afternoon. So on receipt of my monthly quota of magazines, I would very often just glance through them. And the study articles in the magazines are only really studied, of course, at the Watchtower meeting. But this particular study article was the one that really planted the seeds of doubt very deep in me. For decades, the Watchtower taught that the generation who witnessed Jesus' invisible second coming, in inverted commas, in the year 1914, would not die before the day of Armageddon. And the Watchtower of October the 15th, 1988 states that guarding against impatience, no human can work out the date for the end of the present wicked system. Concerning that day or the hour, Jesus said, nobody knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but the Father. And then it goes on to say, might it be, though, that the sign could occur over the span of many human generations? No. The sign is to occur during one particular generation, the same generation that witnessed the beginning of the sign will also witness the climax in a tribulation such as not occurred from the beginning of the creation. And then it goes on to say, but some eagle-eyed Christians who saw World War I are still very much alive. Their generation has not passed away. In 1995, the doctrine regarding the generation was changed. The Watchtower of November the 1st, 1995, pages 16 to 20, now gave a complete new understanding of the issue. It now stated, and I quote from the actual article, the generation that passes away. This was not the first time that the apostles heard Jesus make this comparison of generations, for some days earlier he had stated concerning himself, the Son of Man must undergo many sufferings and be rejected by this generation. Moreover, just as it occurred in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. And then paragraph 12 says, therefore, in the final fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy today, this generation apparently refers to the peoples of earth who see the sign of Christ's presence but fail to mend their ways. So a complete new understanding and interpretation of the generation was punted in 1995. And in hindsight, you could see that the Watchtower faced a dilemma with this doctrine because it was near the original doctrine stated that, the people who saw the start of World War I, that generation would not pass away, and before the Armageddon occurs or the Great Tribulation starts. But time was not on the Watchtower side, because many of these people had now started to die off. And so, of course, the generation doctrine was changed. And we know that recently the generation doctrine changed again. And there was this whole overlapping generations explanation that was just an appalling attempt to justify their doctrine. It's just appalling. So, back to 1995, the Sunday of this particular Watchtower study was one that would stay in my mind for a really long time. And once again, I was faced with a major question in my life. If this is God's organization, why didn't He give us the correct understanding in the first place? Was what I now find myself asking. And yes, I could now see, as I explained before, that in hindsight, the Watchtower was running out of time with this prophecy, and it was starting to prove false. So even though I had all these questions and doubts, I decided to keep them to myself. I would not even mention it to my closest family members, and kept on attending meetings and going out in the field, although the end times was now postponed by the Watchtower. So that's the installment for today. I hope you enjoyed that. I will continue the journey next week. Thank you for joining me again this week. Please, wherever you are listening to this podcast, don't forget to subscribe. If you're listening to it on YouTube or on Apple Podcasts, give us a like, give us a rating. I really appreciate that very much. Thank you, and until next week, bye for now.